The day when the birth turned silent. Chapter 1. The calm before the storm. It was an ordinary morning when the first strange thing happened. The sky was still painted in hues of pink and gold as the sun slowly climbed over the horizon. Birds chirped from the trees, and the soft hum of early morning traffic could be heard in the distance. For all intents and purposes, the world seemed to be going on as it always did, but for one man, something felt wrong. David Shaw, a university professor, stood on the balcony of his apartment in downtown New York. He had just woken up from a restless night, plagued by vivid dreams of strange, almost alien, landscapes. Dreams so real they left him unsettled. He sipped his coffee, gazing at the busy streets below, wondering why the night had been so different from usual. Suddenly, as if someone had hit a pause button on the world, everything went still. The sound of cars driving, of people talking, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, all of it ceased. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. 1 second, the world was alive with noise, and the next nothing. David felt the silence crawl over him. And for a moment, he thought the city had simply gone quiet. But as he looked around, the absence of sound wasn't just in the city. It was everywhere. The hum of the refrigerator in his apartment was gone, the ticking of the clock gone. He closed his eyes, trying to force the sound back. But the silence pressed in from every angle. Double quotes, what is happening? He whispered to himself. Chapter 2. A world without sound. As the day unfolded, David soon realized that the silence was not an isolated incident. The streets of New York, once alive with the frenetic pace of modern life, now appeared eerily vacant. People moved, but their voices did not reach him. He tried calling his wife, Mia, but the phone remained dead, as though no signal had ever existed. In the park, children were playing, but they were silent. The rhythmic sounds of their laughter and shouting were replaced by an unsettling quiet. David could see their mouths moving, but there was no sound. He watched a jogger race past him, her feet pounding the pavement, but all he could hear was the faint echo of his own breath. Panic set in. The world had gone silent, and no one knew why. David rushed back to his apartment, his thoughts racing. Was this some kind of strange phenomenon, a global event? Was it temporary, or was this the new reality? He opened the door to his apartment, looking around as if expecting to find some answer lying in wait, but nothing had changed except the silence. The first few hours were unsettling. But then the reality of the situation began to settle in. What was happening to the world? Where had the sounds gone? David was not alone in his confusion. On the news, images flashed across the screen of reporters sitting in front of cameras, their lips moving, but no words coming out. News anchors scrambled to explain, but all they could offer were bewildered looks and furrowed brows. David couldn't help but wonder, was this a warning, or was it something far worse? Chapter 3. The search for answers. As the day turned into night, David realized that he couldn't stay in his apartment forever. His concern for Mia grew with every passing hour. He had no idea where she was or if she was experiencing the same silence. He had to find her. The city had become an eerie ghost town. The streets, which were once teeming with life, were now devoid of sounds. No honking horns, no street vendors shouting their wares, no music blaring from open windows. David walked down the sidewalks, trying to get to Mia's workplace across town. He couldn't even hear his own footsteps. It was as though the very act of walking had become a soundless affair. As he walked, he noticed something else. People were still going about their business, but their behavior had changed. They were no longer panicked or running. There was no sign of urgency, no calls for help. Instead, they simply moved in, a daze, as though they had grown accustomed to the silence in a way that David had not. David finally reached Mia's office. But it was locked, and there was no answer when he knocked. He scanned the street for any sign of her, but it was as though she had vanished into the silence. His frustration mounted, and just as he was about to give up, he caught sight of a small group of people gathered near the central square. Curiosity piqued, David made his way toward them. As he approached, he noticed that they were not talking or even trying to communicate with one another. They were simply standing in a circle, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something. David joined the group, wondering if anyone had any idea what was going on. He made eye contact with a woman standing next to him. And though her mouth moved, no sound came out. He tried to ask her what was happening, but the words were swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Then, a man in the center of the group raised his hand. He gestured for attention, and everyone went silent, though they had been silent already. With a solemn expression, he started to write something in the dirt with a stick. The message was clear: "We are waiting." David stared at the words for a long time. It didn't make sense. Why were they waiting? What were they waiting for? He felt a deep sense of unease settle in his chest. The silence was no longer just unnerving, it was suffocating. Chapter 4. The sound of nothing. Days passed, and the silence persisted. David's search for answers grew more frantic, but it was as though the world had been reduced to a place where sound could not exist. He tried everything he could think of, turning on the television, searching the internet, even trying to speak aloud. But everything had been swallowed up by the void. In the midst of this, David realized that the silence was not just a physical absence of sound, it had begun to affect people's emotions, their minds. People were growing distant, detached. Conversations had ceased entirely. Families no longer interacted. The once bustling streets of New York were eerily quiet, and the few people who ventured out seemed to walk in a haze, their faces hollow and vacant. David tried to make contact with anyone who might know more about what was happening. He reached out to colleagues, but the emails went unanswered. No one was responding. It was as though the world had turned inward, and all connection had been severed. The idea of silence had expanded beyond just the physical realm. It was now psychological, something that gnawed at the very fabric of human existence. At night, when he lay in bed, David couldn't sleep. He felt a strange pressure inside his chest, as though the silence itself was pressing in from all sides, suffocating him slowly. It was during one of these sleepless nights that he had a terrifying thought. What if this silence was the beginning of the end? Chapter 5. The silent truth. Weeks passed without any change. David's isolation grew, and his fear intensified. He realized that there were no answers coming. No one knew what had caused the silence, and no one seemed to be searching for it. People had become numb, and the world had become an empty shell of its former self. In the silence, David began to question the nature of existence itself. Were the sounds we took for granted, laughter, music, conversation, truly essential to the human experience? Could life exist without them? And if it could, what kind of life was it? Then, one evening, as he walked through the desolate streets of the city, something extraordinary happened. In the far distance, he heard a faint sound. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. His heart leapt in his chest. The sound grew louder, clearer, faint whisper, like a voice from the past. David turned in the direction of the sound, and in the heart of the city, where all had been quiet for so long, he saw a small group of people gathered. They were actually speaking. Their voices were barely audible at first. But then they grew stronger. Words began to fill the air once more. The silence was breaking. Chapter 6, A New Beginning. The return of sound was both a relief and a mystery. People began to speak again, but there was an unspoken understanding that things could never be the same. The world had changed. It had been irrevocably altered by the silence that had swallowed it. David stood among the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment. The question of why the silence had come still lingered, but for the first time in weeks, the world felt alive again, and, though the answers were still unclear, David knew that the silence had taught him something profound. Life, in all its noise and chaos, was fragile. It could be taken from you at any moment, but even in its absence, it had the power to change you forever. The world had turned silent, but now it was finding its voice once more. The end.